This is Charlotte Woods, and I'm delighted to be interviewing Mandy Brass this morning. And Mandy is an acupuncturist working at Dimbleby Cancer Care, part of the oncology, the integrative oncology department. Is that right? At Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, good. And as part of her service evaluation you were doing for your masters, as a practitioner researcher, I think you kind of were slightly taken aback by the challenges of working as a practitioner researcher. And although we are promoting or trying to disseminate research which is to do with the Alexander technique, and obviously acupuncture is very different from the Alexander technique, we do encourage our audience to engage in research on their own practice. So anyone who can speak in the way you are able to talk about that experience and the challenges that dual role of practitioner researcher poses is going to be of interest to our audience. So welcome, Mandy, and thank you very much for agreeing to do the interview.
Thank you, Charlotte. And firstly, just thank you for inviting me. It's quite exciting to be here.
I think it'd be helpful for the audience if you could just start with a very brief thumbnail of the study, things like, the setting, number of participants, broad aim, that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I work in a fully integrated supportive cancer care department in the NHS. I've been an acupuncturist for over 20 years. And it was through my work in the NHS, which I've been doing now for 8 years, that I became interested in research. So that was my journey into research. I was doing what felt like really good work. I thought this would be really interesting and important to try and put some research out there. Had no idea how to go about doing that. Thought I could do a short course to learn how to do research. Oh, how wrong. Realized that wasn't the case, and then embarked on part-time MSc in research. So the project I did was my research project for the completion of my master's. And the thing that interested me at the time was I run 2 clinics. One is a group clinic and one is an individual clinic. And that's really about room allocation in the NHS and using best resources. But I really enjoy group work, and I've been doing group work for many years. And I was very interested in exploring the differences or the outcomes of between the group and the individual acupuncture clinics. So as part of my MSc, I conducted a service evaluation, as you said. So this was rather than a randomized controlled trial or a specific trial. This was evaluating the services that I was already running. And I collected data for a 6-month period. So anyone that was referred through to the service then became evaluated over a 6-month period between October 2022 and March 2023. So it was a while ago now. There were 48 participants in total. So I call them participants. These were the people that were enrolled in the trial. They came in as patients. A few dropped out, and then so there were 43 that were evaluated at the end of the data collection period. So 28 came from the group and 15 came from the individual settings. And so that was the number of participants. And I wanted to, as I say, compare the outcomes and experience of the two. I really wanted to draw out were there relationships between the outcomes and their experience of acupuncture, and how did that differ between the two settings? I really wanted to really get into and explore those differences. So I used 2 different types of questionnaires to gather this data. I gathered outcomes, so this was how well the participants did in their various symptoms. We use something called MyCore, which is Measure Yourself, Concerns and Wellbeing. This is a validated outcome measure that's part of Meaningful Measures. Possibly some of your listeners might have used MyMop.
Yeah.
It's a validated measure used a lot in our complementary therapy world. MyCore has been designed specifically for the cancer world. So slightly different, and it asks participants to rate their 1 or 2 concerns that bother them most, and rate it between 0 and 6, where 6 is as bad as can be and 0 is as good as can be. and also to rate their well-being. This questionnaire was given at the beginning of their first treatment and then again at the end of their sixth treatment. So that was their outcomes. It's just evaluating how well their self-reported symptoms were improving. And then the second questionnaire I gave was a self-designed questionnaire, and this was exploring their experience of acupuncture. So I was looking at expectations, what their experience was. For the people in the group, they had a slightly different, they had a few additional questions about how they liked the group. Was there anything they wanted to say about it, positive or negative? But it was a self-designed questionnaire.
That's great. Yeah, that's really interesting. In November we did a post about using questionnaires with our students. We tend to call them rather than patients, and not all necessarily got a medical problem. And those are a couple of the kinds of questionnaires we talked about. So it's really helpful to have an actual example there. We're mainly thinking about ethical considerations here, I guess. So when you were designing the study at that stage before you actually launched yourself into the process, were there any particular ethical issues that you were trying to address? For example, when you're thinking about how you're going to take consent, or whether you're going to use questionnaires versus interviews?
Sure. So yeah, those two, so consent and questionnaires were the two areas I really addressed in the design of my research. Because I was evaluating my service as it ran, I gave my patients, as they were at their first appointment, a participant information sheet. So I explained to them what the research was about, and I gave them a consent form, but I asked them to take it away with them. And to return it the following week. I wanted my patients to be able to think about whether they wanted to be part of my research away from me. I felt that as I was both the researcher and the practitioner, I was giving them this at the beginning of their treatment when they might be a little bit anxious anyway. I was the person who was about to stick needles into them, and I was asking them for consent.
Yeah.
And it felt like there was definitely an ethical issue there. I didn't want them to give consent just because of participation bias, that they felt obligated to. And there's a power dynamic as I was the comfortable practitioner in the NHS setting asking for consent. So I planned into the design that consent could be given on the second or third treatment, and that if they chose not to consent, I just wouldn't be using their data in my research. And they could still continue to have acupuncture because that's what they had been referred into. So I felt that was quite solid and ethical. My research went through an ethics committee, and so that passed. And then the use of questionnaires was also because I wanted to try and reduce that participation bias or response bias. So it's particularly with smaller numbers, and even though I had 43 responses, that's still considered small numbers. If I hadn't have been the research practitioner, I would have interviewed people. But I thought that because of my role, because of that relationship, that I would get too much response bias, and I wouldn't get the true experience. So I decided to use a self-designed questionnaire, as I explained earlier. And I also thought that giving it to everyone allowed a broader response than using a purposeful sample, selecting 3 or 4 or 5 people out of the trial. So those were my ethical decisions, and it passed the ethics committee. So in that sense, everyone was happy with the way I was running it. And at the point that I started, I thought that was it. My role as research practitioner was about designing the evaluation, ethically minded, and then I could just move on.
Yeah. Okay. And then
exactly. And that's not quite how it
that's
happened.
quite how it happened. Okay. Well, tell us a little bit about the findings in a moment, but since you've just been talking about the ethics, let's come talk about that a bit more now. So what were some of the challenges that came to the fore when you're actually there in the field and doing your research?
So I mean, the first one is everyone did give consent. Now, I wasn't asking for much because they weren't delaying their treatment. There wasn't like a control group where they were having to delay their treatment for, say, 6 weeks or 3 months. I wasn't taking any identifying data. So there wasn't anything specifically ethical that I would expect participants to say, no, I don't want to do this. But it was still I was very aware that everybody gave consent. So I did wonder whether there was an obligation that I was the only acupuncturist. I am the only acupuncturist in the service, or I particularly was at that point. So it would have been quite awkward to not give consent. I absolutely tried to encourage everyone so that it would not affect their treatment, it would not affect their ongoing treatment. The choice was definitely theirs. But I still feel that possibly there was some level of bias towards giving consent. So I was aware of that. It was something to reflect on. There were one or two people that, I think there were two in total that didn't come back after the first treatment. The most likely outcome for that was they didn't like acupuncture.
Mm.
I think one person actually had work obligations and couldn't return. But I will never know whether they also felt that they didn't want to give consent and didn't want to say. So that was definitely an issue. It was something I reflected on. I couldn't really give an answer to it, but it was an awareness that it was there. The bigger ethical issues came in with the questionnaires. The hospital that I work in has a very diverse population, both ethnically, socioeconomically, and in terms of the number of people that don't have English as a first language. So there were a number of the questionnaires that were missing some answers, or there were a few yes or no answers on the questionnaire, and then there were a lot of open-ended questions. And there were a few questionnaires where the open-ended questions were just not answered at all. And I wondered whether that was a literacy or English wasn't, written English wasn't good enough. I had as one of my inclusion criteria able to speak English, and there was one or two people that were excluded because the communication wasn't strong enough. And we used a translator, but it's very hard when you are speaking to someone to know whether their written English is good. And so these were people that were part of my research, but the responses on their questionnaire suggested that that I wasn't getting the full answers. And so by using questionnaires to expand all my participants, I ended up excluding a subgroup because of that.
Mm.
And then secondly, there were instances, and this I really had to grapple with. What my patients were telling me orally during their treatments in terms of their symptomatic improvements were not reflected in what they wrote.
Mm.
And that was quite a challenge for me. And when it first started happening, I was deeply concerned that this would affect my data, this would affect my write-up, and so how can I square the two? Should I be including what they say to me? And I would encourage anyone that's involved in research, particularly, well, I think just across the board, but particularly as a researcher practitioner, I used a research journal quite heavily. And I engaged in a lot of reflection over the process. And it became apparent to me, I was reading a lot about being a researcher practitioner, that there is this tension between, as a practitioner, to provide my duty of care to my patients, and my researcher brain being curious to know what's going on and what's happening. And I learned through using my journal and then being very reflexive in the moment to turn off that researcher brain, and just be there for my patients. And then to only take what was given to me as the researcher. And not be as initially, that was hugely frustrating. And by the end, I felt more comfortable with the process. It was definitely a difficult process to try and figure out how I felt about this and to ensure I was doing the best for my patients.
Mm. Yeah, no, but deeply, deeply, I absolutely hear what you're saying. I've been there myself, and yeah, it really is very, very challenging. Yeah. So it sounds like your journal was a very important way of dealing with those challenges. So was that you kind of one of your main tools for working through those issues? Yeah.
It was, particularly as I was on my own. I wasn't, and I guess this would be the case for many of Alexander Technique teachers. You are very much a solo practitioner. I was conducting this research on my own. I mean, yes, I had a my supervisor and academic side, but I was conducting this on my own, and I was aware of those conflicts going on. Nearly on a weekly basis, where someone would say something, or I'd read a form and think, that's quite different. So yes, I felt that was very important,
Yeah.
but I felt it benefited me as a practitioner as well as a researcher. So
Hmm.
I've been a practitioner for over 20 years, and I think that I grew as a practitioner, which I wasn't expecting,
Mm.
because by so deeply reflecting on the process made me also evaluate my approach with my patients,
Yeah.
even though that was separate to my research. So
Yeah.
yes, I use my journal a lot, and I would encourage anyone to do so.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting process.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. I used mine very heavily when I was researching on my practice, and the idea that you're kind of growing your practice as well and sort of developing both sides, both roles, is I think is absolutely right. Yeah, certainly chimes with my experience. So you talked a bit about some of the challenges. So what about the potential benefits? So if you've got this dual role of practitioner researcher, can you think of any ways that that's beneficial from having the kind of
Um,
more objective, distanced researcherly to sort of traditional researcherly stance?
I think for me, the research was so very meaningful. This is my work. I'm invested in it. I love what I do. I chose to get involved in research because I think it's really important for the wider community to understand the value of the work I do. So I am, no one is going to think that this work is more important than me. So, and I think that shines through. I think it is very, very meaningful. I think that shines through the written word as well. I think, if you're interested, no one else is going to research your clinics. No one else is going to research your particular, maybe if it's, from a case history through to, a 6-month evaluation. I think, I think that's quite meaningful. Um, and I think that because we often work in our own little silos and we work individually, actually, if you can put some research out there, and it doesn't have to be research that is publishable and peer reviewed, it can be, a blog for a professional body, it can be a case history for, a professional magazine or website. But I think putting our results out there and explaining the work we do, I think benefits our patients or our students in your case,
Mm.
as well as the wider community of people who might refer to us or learn from it, and the general population. Um, I think if you have a practice and you are speaking to your patients or students about I'm interested in evaluating my outcomes and finding out the experience, and it's in order to develop my practice, that's going to benefit those patients.
Course.
They're gonna want that to happen too. So I think overall it's of benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, great. Yeah. Um, I think there's an additional wrinkle. Most Alexander Technique teachers won't be working for a charity, won't be funded, won't be working for the NHS, that kind of thing. Some may, but not many. So most will charge for their services. So perhaps there's something you could say about the kind of additional ethical challenges that might impose.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Obviously, you're not going to be able to be doing randomized controlled trials if you're charging private patients. So you're not going to be able to, which I mentioned before, put someone into a control or a holding, you can't randomize them into a group. But if you are conducting research that's more evaluating services, I actually don't think charging has any implications. I think you have to think very hard about ensuring that you take consent and that and that you explain the process at the beginning, and that if someone doesn't want to do it, that they, as I explained earlier, possibly if someone's paying, they are more likely to say, actually, I just want to have this relationship. Working in the NHS, and as I said, in my department, I was the only acupuncturist. If someone didn't really want to take part in it, they couldn't then say, well, I'm just going to go see another acupuncturist because I didn't really want to do it. Actually, if this is a paying practice, I think it's easier for someone to say, I don't want to take part in this. But I also think the two can be very much separated. I think evaluating your service, whether it's just looking at outcomes or asking about experience at beginning and end of the process, I don't think has an impact on taking payment. I feel quite comfortable with that, and I have in my own private practice. I have a small private practice as well. I have occasionally asked for consent from paying patients, and I don't think that makes a difference.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Yeah, no, I have done as well, but mostly when I've done research, it's been sort of people haven't been paying. It's been in a care home, or I've said you can have some lessons for free if when people didn't have a lot of money or they didn't really want to. If you like, just give us some. Tell us what your outcomes are. We'll have a little chat about it, that kind of thing. Just as a as a way of doing very informal but not published research.
I think people are quite interested in outcomes. So explaining what you're doing and why you're doing it and offering to share your outcomes with them, I think I think for a lot of people, if they're engaging in a process, that they're actually interested.
Yeah.
Feel quite valued to be asked their opinion. So yeah, like I said, so long as it's very clear at the outset what you're doing, I think ethically that's okay.
Yeah. Okay, great. And have you got any advice for audience members who might be thinking of conducting a study on their own practice? Beyond,
I mean, I would say just do it. Presumably, there are maybe within your organization, there are people that they can have a chat with about how to go about doing it. But, starting simply and writing up maybe one case study, or starting very simply and gathering outcomes just from asking people if they can, a before and after, and just see how that goes. Write something up for your local professional newsletter. Just start very simply and then keep going. It's a bit of a bug, I would say.
Yeah.
I started with this line, this would be quite interesting, and I've having gone through the process, I now want to take it further. So it's definitely, yes, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
And all my patients that engage with me, so I now take consent from everybody on the basis that I may well be interested in writing this up. And I would say that everyone mostly is interested to have their outcomes gathered, to feel like they're participating in the process of seeing if this works.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Just say a very quick thing maybe about your findings, because there was a kind of quite interesting thing about group versus individuals, I thought that.
Yeah, so the findings of my study showed that there was no difference between group and individual acupuncture in terms of the outcomes. The really interesting finding, which as far as I can tell is new, so I haven't seen this anywhere else, where symptoms didn't get better or they even got worse, which can happen for sure in a cancer centre when you're working with people who are going through treatments and are very unwell. What I found out, and this was across the board, across both group and individual acupuncture sessions, that their experience of acupuncture was still positive. So those non-specific aspects of the the acupuncture consultation. So, the therapeutic relationship, the environment, the positive touch, the consultation process all led to a positive experience, irrelevant of outcomes. And that was quite interesting. But then there's been lots of research that has shown that to be the case already. And there has been other research, not specifically in a cancer center, showing that there is no difference between group and individual acupuncture, which, as I said, I was really pleased to find out. The new finding for me was within those participants that were in the group, there were a few people, it was only 4 out of the 28, but there were 4 people who it's not so much didn't like the group, had a negative comment to make. So someone said they just would have preferred to be on their own. Someone didn't like to hear other people's problems, or didn't want to feel like other people thought that they were listening to their problems. So for a couple of people, there was a slight awkwardness, or someone felt like they had to remind themselves to be quiet. Most people really engaged with the group process, felt like there was comments like we were all in it together, really enjoyed knowing that there were other people in the same situation. But there were a few people that didn't particularly like it. And what was interesting is that for those few people, that had no impact on their outcomes. So they still responded positively. So it shows that that negative experience of the group where it happens doesn't impact that therapeutic relationship or those non-specific effects of acupuncture that are all about the relationship. It's very specific to aspects of the group and has no impact on outcomes. So if you're working in a group environment for a cost-effective reason, so both for the NHS, I just get to see more patients for the same amount of time, but I guess that's the case as well working privately. There were many positives to the group, so most people actually found the group experience enhanced their experience. And for those few that don't particularly like it, they're still going to get benefit of the therapeutic intervention, whether that's Alexander technique, whether it's acupuncture, or whatever group setting you work in. And I thought that was a really interesting outcome that I found out.
Mm-hmm. Just fascinating, yeah. Was there anything particularly about the individual? You mentioned things about the group setting that people didn't like. Were there things particularly about the group or the individual setting that they did like?
So interestingly, when asked about what is your experience of acupuncture, how did you, I can't now remember the specific questions, but people in the group talked about the group. So they talked about the environment, the music, the lighting, the chairs, the interaction. I mean, it's quite a quiet setting, my particular group. The patients aren't chatting with each other, but still that sense of there was very much, it was all about the group, and that being a positive, knowing that other people are going through the same thing as them. Whereas the people in the one-to-one sessions very much focused on the therapeutic relationship when they talked about their experience. And even though I have the same music, also dim the lighting in a one-to-one room, they are never mentioned in the one-to-one. So it's an interesting difference. There is something about the group environment where it is the group that influences the experience. Whereas the one-to-one, no matter what you create in the environment, it's very much more about that relationship you have.
Yeah, I think that's very, very interesting. And I'm sure that those insights will be of interest to the Alexander community as well. That's absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much. You've been very generous with your time.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much for inviting me.